Hi, I'm Steve Schindler.
I'm Katie Wilson-Milne.
Welcome to the Art Law Podcast, a monthly podcast exploring the places where art intersects with and interferes with the law.
And vice versa. The Art Law Podcast is sponsored by the law firm of Schindler, Cohen & Hochman, LLP, a premier litigation and art law boutique in New York City.
So some of you may have listened to our podcast on technologizing fine art with Jason Bailey, and we've decided to take that on the road, and Jason, Katie, and I will be in conversation on technology in the art world at the Moniker Art Fair, which will be in New York on May 1st at 6:30. We hope to see you there to talk more about digital art and artificial intelligence and generative art and all of those great topics. Hi, Katie.
Hi, Steve.
How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm excited for today's podcast.
Great. We're going to be talking today about art crime and money laundering and how to prevent it. We're fortunate to be joined today by two people who are experts in this area. We're here with Michael Shepard and Laura Patten to talk about new laws and regulations imposing obligations on art dealers to investigate who their clients really are and where their money comes from. Laura Patten is a specialist leader in Deloitte's risk and financial advisory. She leads the firm's art and finance initiatives in the United States. Laura is an authority on risk management and business intelligence as creators of value and competitive advantage in the global marketplace. She works closely with Deloitte's tax, strategy, research, and technology experts to provide a range of business services to the art world. Laura previously served in the U.S. government, first as a CIA operations officer and later as the head of intelligence for the FBI's art crime team. She holds a master's in international affairs from Columbia University and a master's in art business from Sotheby's Institute of Art. Michael Shepard is Deloitte's global financial crime practice leader and is an advisory principal in Deloitte Transactions and Business Analytics, LLP. He has led a wide variety of anti-money laundering, sanctions, and financial crime-related projects and investigations at financial institutions and within other industry sectors. Previously, Michael was head of financial crime compliance and deputy general counsel at a leading full-service retail national bank, a partner in a major law firm focused on white-collar criminal defense, AML regulatory matters, asset forfeiture, and internal corporate investigations, and a prosecutor for the U.S. Department of Justice Tax Division. Welcome, Michael and Laura.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So before we get to some of these new laws and regulations, why don't you just tell us a little bit about what you do and how you came to this kind of work?
Sure. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Katie. I mean, you gave my background. So how did I get to this type of work? I prosecuted tax crimes and related financial crimes, including money laundering. I was a defense attorney for a long time, defending those accused of such crimes. I was head of financial crime compliance, so I got to see it firsthand, being on the front line in a financial institution. And now for the last 14 years, being a consultant in financial crime risk management, mostly for financial institutions. I have to think about and sit around and think about ways that I would launder illicit proceeds.
That must be fun.
And it is fun.
If you were so lucky to have so many illicit proceeds.
Exactly. If I can figure out how I would launder money, if I was a criminal, I'm in a better position to help my clients. And again, mostly financial institutions. Well, one of the ways I imagined over the last couple of years is art. And we're going to talk about that today.
Great. Laura?
Well, I spent 16 years with the federal government in intelligence and law enforcement. And, part of my job as an operations officer was to figure out how to do things that people couldn't necessarily see, right? So while in that case you're doing it for the interests of your government, you're trying to obtain information and speak truth to power, you also have to think, how would I move money, people, and information across borders in a way that law enforcement probably isn't going to detect? So that developed my interest. Also, I've studied art, etc. And then when I was asked to come to the FBI, I did so because the Bureau was running terrific tactical cases. I mean, their agents are the best in the world, hands down. But there wasn't anyone who could apply a sort of a macro level view of these cases and these schemes. Because when you have a case in LA, it mirrors the market, right? It's probably not just in LA. There's probably part of it that's happening in New York. Or consider the Dolly. There are many Dolly prints that were sold that were fakes in Chicago. Well, those came out of Spain and Italy, right? So it's a network analysis, and here I am.
So how or when did you both encounter art in the intersection of your career? When did that first come into your professional scope?
So we've been discussing trade-based money laundering for years. Trade-based money laundering is simply used, and we're going to talk about this more today. Trade-based money laundering is simply using goods, commodities, to transfer value. And art can be a valuable commodity and a good way to transfer value to someone maybe who you owe money to, or you want to get money in, use it for illicit purposes, to transfer it over the border. We're going to talk about that more a little bit today. And so, while I was imagining ways to launder money, and art being one of them, trade-based money laundering really came to mind. And that was really solidified when Laura came to the firm, and we had actually an art specialist. And so I've been able to learn a lot about the art world through her and talking to folks like yourselves who deal with the art world on a regular basis.
Great.
When I was at the CIA, I spent a lot of time working in places where art is important. So I became aware of the art market then. Really, I dug into it when I went to the FBI.
And maybe one more background question, I think our listeners will be interested. When and why did the FBI start getting interested in art in less of a one-off crime way and in more of a sort of subject matter expertise?
So there has always been one or two agents dedicated to this,
Just to art.
Just to art, right. In 2003, when the U.S. occupied Iraq and the Baghdad Museum was looted, with U.S. troops standing across the street protecting the oil ministry, but they were not tasked with protecting the museum. The fallout from that was pretty severe, at least from a reputational perspective for the U.S. Those were not just Iraqi treasures, those were world treasures that were stolen. And so the government responded with what we call a whole-of-government response, where the State Department, the FBI, the Department of Defense all came together. I guess if we had a Ministry of Culture, they would probably have been involved. But the Smithsonian was involved to figure out, okay, how are we going to first try to find all these objects, these cultural treasures that have been stolen, and second, stand up a capability to try to avoid this in the future. So it was around 2003 that the FBI art crime team was formally established, but that's not to say that there weren't agents working on these issues before.
So what kind of crimes are you seeing today in the art market, generally speaking?
Sure. High-end authenticity frauds. That's nothing new, right? We've seen those for years. Looting, which also includes terrorist financing, and that's something that, whether it's new or just we're more aware of it, is clearly an issue. Theft, and more complex financial crimes. So I'm glad we're talking about money laundering. In the era of art as an asset, we need to start looking at fractional ownership. There's a lot of legitimate fractional ownership, but it's pretty opaque.
Right. So when you say money laundering, I think people have an idea of what that means, but maybe aren't aware that there's a legal definition versus a colloquial definition and sort of what that legal definition is. So, I don't know, Steve, can you talk a little bit about what money laundering actually is?
Sure. First of all, it's a federal crime here in the United States.
So don't do it.
Don't. And it's a serious federal crime. It's found in the U.S. Code sections 1956 and 1957. It's a crime that, first of all, requires intent So it's not something that, from a criminal perspective, that you sort of accidentally walk into, but it generally requires knowledge that property involved in a financial transaction comes from some form of unlawful activity, and that you have to know either that you are promoting the carrying out of that unlawful activity, or at least knowing that the transaction was intended to disguise the nature, the location, the source, the ownership of those proceeds. And if you do that knowingly, you can be subject to substantial financial fines of twice the value of the transaction, and you can go to jail for 20 years.
All right, so today we're talking about how the art world is sort of implicated in a lot of these financial crimes, particularly money laundering. And so I guess one thing we want to understand is how significant is this problem in the art world? And if it is significant, what is it about the art world that's encouraging this or facilitating it?
So let me start with just adding a few things to what Steve said, and
Sure.
I will answer your question, Katie, which is really the three elements of money laundering, just putting it into its basics. So as Steve said, it's found in 18 U.S.C. sections 1956 and 1957. And the way we think about it as practitioners, and you'll see how this relates to the art world as well, are three terms: placement, layering, and integration. Well, what's placement? Placement is I have illicit proceeds, whether it's from narco trafficking, embezzlement, theft. I need to place that money into the financial system, into a bank, into a financial institution, or some other usable form. So if it's cash, they have currency transaction reporting requirements. I then may have to, what we call, smurf it into the bank.
What does that mean, smurf?
Using mules to structure transactions under the $10,000 threshold and depositing it into multiple accounts.
So you break it up.
Multiple accounts. You can't just use one account, and then consolidating later. Now, banks do monitor for all of this, both for the structuring as well as having related accounts and then consolidating the money. Now, they only see a slice of it in their bank. They don't see it across banks, as you know. If it's cash, I may be able to buy goods. There is an IRS form that has to be filed, Form 8300, if you receive over $10,000 cash in a trade or business. So if I did buy a piece of art, a gallery would have to file that form. So let's say I placed my proceeds into the bank. I succeeded in doing that. So I've now placed the money. Now I need to layer it. What is layering? Layering is basically engaging in additional transactions that are designed to move those tainted funds, those illicit funds, further away from the source. It may be transferring money, engaging in fictitious sales, having fictitious invoices to nominee companies, shell companies. It could be just transferring the money into other accounts to move it away. And then lastly, integration into regular commerce. I would buy a home. I would buy a business. I could buy art at this point. Now I'm integrating it into the economy. So if an agent ever showed up at my door, a government agent, I could show them, this is from my business.
Right. This is from X Gallery.
Right. It's not from some crime.
Right.
The initial premise is that most clients, buyers and sellers, are not money launderers. Okay, they're few and far between. However, the art industry is newer to the concept that it might be susceptible and an unwitting player in money laundering and financial crime. It was traditionally a handshake industry where privacy was respected, it was valued. You can imagine the scene, in the movie or TV show where you have the intermediary bidding and he's got his client on the phone, the unseen client on the phone.
Right.
The price keeps going up. Perceptions become reality, whether or not that's true or not. And you don't see what's going behind the scenes, that the auction house actually knows who that unseen bidder is on the phone and that they are doing know your customer. Also, the art industry generally doesn't think that money laundering is a real risk. But one really can't make that conclusion until you perform a money laundering risk assessment and assess the controls in place that might mitigate that inherent risk for money laundering. There are fewer AML, anti-money laundering compliance professionals in the art world. Most are at the banks. We have limited and inconsistent regulation. Art is easily moved across a border. In fact, today it's probably more easily transferable across a border than a wire transaction in a bank, which is monitored by banks. The banks have gotten fairly sophisticated in this. It's not perfect by any means. But, the money launderers know what the banks do. They track that. Money launderers listen. Today's money launderers are more sophisticated. They're more agile. They're computer savvy. They're globally organized. They're borderless. They move money very quickly, and they know how to do it. So that makes the market susceptible to money laundering. There is a perceived risk. How much is occurring? That is a different question.
So pivoting off what you just said, Michael, one thing from an investigative perspective that I've always found challenging is that the traditional way of doing business in the art market, the practices and procedures, are completely normal for people in the market. But for anyone outside, they're big red flags.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
You buy a high-value object in New York, and then you send it to a free port in a third country for onward passage to a fourth country, and the payment is coming out of Guernsey, the Panama. As a law enforcement or intelligence professional, steam's going out the ears.
Right.
Someone in an auction house, this is just how you do business. And to be fair, the ultra high net worth individuals and institutions that can afford the blue chip top price art, they live lifestyles that are different than mine.
I've
right?
discovered that.
Yeah. So it's not crazy that a piece of art would move along that trajectory in these situations.
So
Right?
part of what you guys are saying, which Steve and I certainly witness regularly, is that the art world, and let's put the auction houses aside because I do think there's a distinction to be made between the auction houses today and private sales,
Yes.
where I think all of these opacity issues are much more severe. But, the art world, it creates a lot of its value from secrecy and having many intermediaries who can take a slice along the way. So there's a huge incentive in the way the industry has always operated and been structured, and that has become normal for people inside of it. We can query whether that's acceptable or not. That this is, we don't ask these kinds of questions. We don't worry about where the money comes from. So
Right. But that's a problem when you find out that it comes from someplace bad. That's great. Looking the other way might seem like a great idea until it's not, right? I mean, consider the Nodler case, right? I mean, tranche payments just below the $10,000
Cash limit, yeah.
cash limit. I mean,
Yeah, there were a lot of red flags
That's a red
in that
flag.
case, yeah.
the other thing is I think consumers are becoming attuned to this. During the Armory show just a couple weeks ago, I was talking to some very high-level collectors who said, it seems like everyone in the trade is afraid of instituting anti-money laundering, anti-financial crime procedures. And this guy had worked on Wall Street. He said, but in my experience, when you have greater policies, procedures, controls, there's more confidence in the market goes up.
Right.
yeah, I think they're worried about a friction in between those stages, and
Right.
that in between will weed out people who don't have the ability or the resources to put in place these procedures, and so there will be a shift, an inevitable shift, I think. But
And Laura makes a good point about structure of transactions, and there's actually a bank analogy. There may be good reasons to structure deals the way they're structured. We just may not understand them. There can be safety reasons. The banking analogy that I would make is a hold mail order. A Mexico client at a New York bank may ask the bank, hold my mail, hold my statements. Don't send them in the mail to me.
Right. For very good
For
reasons.
very good safety reasons. The postmaster, the mail person may open it, look at it, sell that information to someone, and then the wealthy family that's asked for their statement to be withheld, now they're outed, and they could be, higher risk of kidnapping, higher risk of paying ransoms and things of that nature. So there are reasons sometimes that law enforcement may not understand in the first instance why a transaction is structured the way it is.
Can you talk a little bit also about the sort of subjective values of art? Does that sort of play into susceptibility? Because unlike gems and other things that have been used for money laundering in the past, the value is in flux and subjective.
Absolutely. I mean, a border patrol or a customs agent, 99.9% are not trained to even identify the difference between a poster and a piece of high-value art.
Or a Basquiat, for example.
Yes, for example, exactly. So the subjective nature of it makes it easier to justify its value on either side of the transaction, right? Because it's not as though there is a standard catalog. It's not like diamonds, right? Where you have a scale, you know what the market price is, you can grade them. You can't just easily look at the cut, the clarity, etc.
Right, so you could pay $100 million for something to try to move that money when you could have bought it for $50 million or something, and it would be very hard to detect that gap.
Right, or consider not even the value, but whether something is even art. Brancusi, right?
Right. U.S. versus Brancusi, first principles.
That's right.
Right. And, Dan Flavin's had some of these issues too. If you're shipping a box of light bulbs to Europe, how does the customs, authority look at that?
Right.
And, treat it in terms of customs duties and stuff.
And very few of the items at the border, they're all supposed to be inspected, but, it's well known that most of them aren't. The vast majority, they don't have the capacity to do it. They try to use technology. The technology recently found, I believe, a huge shipment of cocaine. Technology found that. The subjectivity is in favor of the money laundering. And it's easily transferable, gets across the border quickly. If I want to pay a bribe to a foreign official, which would be a violation of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act here in the United States, why use money anymore? I could buy a piece of art, transfer it over, maybe sell it for $100, sell it for $2,000, and it could be, a very expensive piece of art that I bought for my corporation to hang in the boardroom. I use that instead.
Right. And then that can sit in a free port for some number of years, and
then they can sell it.
Right.
So it strikes us that the art world is uniquely susceptible to money laundering in a way that other industries, both because of their regulation, but also because of just historic business practices, are not in the same way. And we have this perfect confluence of, that culture of secrecy, of trust, of handshakes, of not hiring lawyers or, experts to deal with transactions on the private sale side, and a skyrocketing value of art and a heightened interest in art, all coming together, which are maybe making money laundering and financial crimes in the art world more prevalent today or more obvious today. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Well, from my perspective, and hearing feedback from people who are at TAFE and talking about this, many gallerists do feel that they are being unfairly painted as criminals, right? And they don't think it's necessary. And more seasoned collectors who haven't had an issue, right, also think it's not a big deal, and they value that privacy. But looking at who are the new collectors and the collectors going forward, we're talking about millennial generations, Z generations, and they're all about transparency in everything. They live out loud. So I think that while the acceptance of anti-money laundering regulations and good practices may be sort of starting slowly in the market, I think it's going to pick up.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, and I don't think we're saying art galleries are criminals or knowing criminals.
Right.
No one says that banks are criminals, and complicit.
They're just interacting with potential criminals.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right, but that doesn't mean that there's no risk.
Right, and I think that's why galleries resent this, because they feel like, look, I'm not a criminal.
Right.
I'm just in a client service industry. If someone comes to me, why am I being blamed for their illegal activity?
Because here's an example. So I spent several hours with a prolific art forger. And we were talking about his methodology, not just the material of the painting, but also the con, right? The con artist. Well, the whole point of a con artist, whether they are trying to use you to get you to buy a fake Buttersworth, or whether they are trying to use you to pass their dirty money through you, to launder their money, they have gained your confidence.
Sure.
And this individual told me about the lengths he would go to. It often took a long time, so that you would think he was your friend by the time you were being used. And often you're not going to know that you've been exploited until the con is over and you're stuck holding the bag. That's why it's so important for gallerists to try to mitigate the risk. There's always a risk, and it can be done within a reasonable cost and operational burden.
This is the challenge between, which we see a lot, and I totally agree with that. I mean, we see our gallery clients as victims of this problem, not perpetrators of it, and framing it that way, I think, is helpful to understand. One of the challenges is that there's usually not a budget line for legal or professional advice like this. So rather than paying, a minimal amount of money compared to the overall budget up front to get some procedures, paperwork in place, more often, and this is changing a little bit, galleries will not do that. They just won't spend the money on it until something goes horribly wrong, and then they will spend 100 times that amount. And the tax problems have sort of been a microcosm of that, and I think an example of the same problem happening in the money laundering setting, which is that, galleries forever would do whatever their customers wanted them to do about where to ship it, collect tax, not collect tax. And they were like, look, I pay corporate tax on whatever happens at the end of the day, and so I'm not, this sales tax, use tax, they give me a resale certificate, I won't worry about it. But, state financial departments, including the IRS for non-sales tax reasons, but for sales tax, state authorities, started investigating this stuff with a lot more rigor in the last few years. And they subpoenaed the galleries to get information, and they had to give grand jury testimony. And so they got brought into this world in a very abrupt way because of that laissez-faire sort of approach. And I think there are some parallels, and maybe a cultural connection between how that was handled and how they see money laundering issues.
If we're serious about fighting money laundering and terrorist financing, it cannot be only the banks that are involved in that fight. If I were talking to a gallery, I would give an example, because I'm always thrown back, well, we're not a bank. Why should we be doing this? And I would talk to them about other examples of industries that are subject to having anti-money laundering compliance programs. The gatekeepers, I call them. That would be one example. Gatekeepers are lawyers and accountants that are used by money launderers, by criminals, to set up shell corporations, to help them move money, to create trusts that have nominee directors, the shell game, as we call it, so we can move the money. That's a perfect example of another industry where they're not criminals. They're not, most of them, but they're being used by the criminals. In order not to be used unwittingly by the criminals and just put your head in the sand, you need to create a risk-based financial crime compliance program. And it doesn't need to cost that much money. It's certainly going to cost less money in the end than it would to be fined or to be thrown in jail and charged criminally with aiding and abetting a money launderer.
Let's talk a little bit about what galleries can do to identify risk and to mitigate those risks.
Well, the first place to start, I believe, is always with performing a money laundering risk assessment. That involves assessing who are your customers, both buyers and sellers, what types of products and services do you offer, what type of channels are used to provide those products and services. Are they in person? Are they on the telephone? Are they on the internet? Are they through an intermediary? Each one of those channels will have different inherent risks. In what jurisdictions do you, the gallery, operate in? What jurisdictions are your customers in? So after assessing what the inherent money laundering risk is across all those dimensions, you would assess what existing controls mitigate those inherent risks and what's the residual risks. And by assessing the existing controls, one would also be able to determine and identify, do I have any gaps? Do I have to enhance existing controls, or do I just not have a control in place? And then to remediate those gaps and develop the risk-based controls. Also, I have a feeling, this is a feeling, a sense of mine, that larger galleries are sitting on data. We're computer-based now. They're sitting on data. They can make use of that data in order to do a lot of this. And again, it doesn't need to be expensive. Yes, it's going to be an added cost, but it can be risk-based.
Right. So are you saying, to some extent, a small gallery on the Lower East Side of New York who basically deals with clients in New York, are they at a lower kind of risk assessment than, say, a large international gallery that is dealing with clients all over the world and going to art fairs all over the world? Is that a different kind of operation, and do they need to sort of address these things differently?
My answer would be it ought to be. And the reason I say it ought to be is because it's domestic, meaning here in the U.S., but New York is a higher risk city for money laundering within the United States.
The other thing, if you look at how, say, frauds in general are perpetrated in the art market, say a stolen object, right? Say you have a stolen object, you want to clean it, and you always sell it first. The criminal sells it to a small auction house or to a small gallery, and then it builds provenance before it gets to the big galleries or auction houses.
Smart.
Yeah.
So, to answer your question, maybe?
Right.
There are some free resources out there for galleries. The Responsible Art Market, for example, which is a nonprofit, has published some very, I assess them as being very common sense, step-by-step procedures that galleries can
And those are sort of
take.
best practices.
Best practices, yeah.
Right, because one thing, when I'm listening to Michael's talking about these risk assessments, I think, for your average dealer, let's take the top 5 galleries out of this. They have no idea what any of that means. First of all, they're not asking their clients where the money comes from, and the idea of that is so off-putting to them that they can't, they don't know what a risk assessment is. They're not going to be able to track this stuff.
So the gallery owner, not the individual dealers, that's where this needs to come from, right? This needs to come from the top down and say, if you're a dealer in my gallery, because they all have sort of their own businesses within the galleries, these are the procedures thou shalt follow. Right?
But there are a lot of dealers who are not tied to galleries, right? In fact,
well, that's true. Yes. So I can see that it sounds intimidating, absolutely. But the alternative of not doing that is...
people aren't even... No one's doing OFAC searches, all kinds of things that should already be done and are required.
What do you think? What do you hear from your clients about these 2 questions? Are they asking for help around money laundering, number 1? And number 2, there's been talk about a consortium among galleries to address this. What are your thoughts on that?
I've had ad hoc questions, and the questions come in just not so much, we want to revamp or adopt guidelines, but here's this transaction, and here's where the money's coming from, and there's where the art is going. Does this sound funny to you, right? And so some are at least sensitized to the idea that they need to ask these questions. I think the next step would be to encourage them to engage with it in a more systematic way. So I think, my experience is a sort of, they're getting it. They're getting it when when the red flags really sort of pop up. But, I think what's a little scarier when you don't have a program, and I think you had mentioned it before, Laura, that the typical con artist works over time. So it may not be just the very strange transaction that walks in off the street that you've never heard of this person before, you don't know anything about where they got their money from, but it's someone who you've known for a longer period of time. And then it's harder to ask those questions, like, where did the money come from for this transaction? And frankly, because we deal with the auction houses, they ask those questions. So it's not inconceivable, but it does seem, I think, to Katie's point, if someone walks into my gallery and wants to buy a piece of art, then I say, well, where did your money come from? It's a very intrusive sounding question in a business, any kind of business context.
Yeah, and maybe it's worth now drawing this distinction between the major auction houses and dealers, because the major auction houses do carry risk and they deal with the consequences of that risk on a regular basis. So it's not to say it doesn't exist there, but auction houses today are both regulated externally and internally in a way that leads them to have detailed contracts, to do provenance research, to want to find out who the beneficial owners are, to some extent, in a way that is very different than the gallery and non-gallery private dealer setting. And so when, I think about the biggest concerns I have in this space, it's often for clients or parties who have the least resources and expertise to deal with it, which are the private dealers, versus the auction houses, which have staff already putting these kinds of procedures in place and look at it all the time.
And they've hired
exactly.
money laundering compliance professionals.
Right, they have people who do this.
Whether they're former assistant U.S. attorneys from the United States Attorney's Office, from the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, from banks, they've already gone through that journey, and they have in place and continue to enhance their anti-money laundering compliance programs. It is the level below that where a lot of the concern ought to lie, because there is less expertise, it's costly, it's intrusive. As Steve mentioned, it's not the way they do business. On the other hand, we'll talk about some examples of some cases later where the art dealer was caught up in laundering money. And to Steve's point about the con artist working over time, that was the same thing with the gatekeepers, with the lawyers in Jersey and Guernsey and the accountants. The criminals would work with them on legitimate deals over time, but then they would start increasing and then they would start expanding. But then they were also stuck dealing with that client.
Right. So let's talk about some specific red flags. And at the outset of this, I think it's worth noting that some things that are red flags are also absolutely normal and the way, dealers have always done things, which include things like buying through shell companies or trusts or, all kinds of entities that build a barrier between the transaction and the real person on the other side and the source of funds. And that's been true forever. And so I think there's a sense that there's a comfort with some things that are also could be seen as red flags that complicate this in the art world. But let's talk about some of those.
Right. That's what I was saying about the policies and procedures, the business practices of the art market from an investigative perspective is always challenging, because if you're used to investigating white-collar crime in another industry and you are on your first case in the art market, oh my God, there are red flags everywhere. You really have to parse those. So, let's look at red flags across the people, the transactions, and the objects. And I'll start with people. Now, if they are reluctant to provide information and documentation, right? If you're unable to verify the beneficial owner identity and income source, if the counterparty lives, works, or banks in high-risk locations, if the individual is a sanctioned, politically exposed person.
And how would you know that?
That information is publicly available. You can Google it on the Treasury's website or FinCEN's website. I would also add, and this may seem very obvious, people who have the capability of producing art or accessing art. And that may seem obvious, but I'll just give you an example of an art fraud. It was not money laundering per se, but John Ray, who is in prison now for forging and selling as authentic numerous Jackson Pollocks, before he launched this scheme, he'd spent 5 years in federal prison for counterfeiting U.S. currency. A person who can counterfeit U.S. currency can definitely make splatter paintings. I mean, that's just right. That was at high risk, and that information was publicly available. But you don't think about that, right? You don't think, oh, I'm going to enter this person's name in the Bureau of Prison website and see if they were ever in prison. So, anyway.
Well, now it's on a checklist.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
that's a great example.
Just tell us a little bit. I want to go back to a couple of the categories. Unable to verify the beneficial owner in a transaction is a red flag. What do you mean by that?
So what I mean is, we were talking about the tradition of using trusts, right, or an agent to conduct a transaction for you. If you don't know, if the agent is unwilling to tell you who they're representing, that's a concern. Now, I know historically that was fine. Well, the auction houses are now saying that's not fine. So I posit that it's going to be a value proposition, right? And increasingly, the buyers who want to make sure that they are transacting at the highest standards are going to go to the auction houses. And the global, I'm talking about the blue chip, highest end international galleries, they could hire one person to run compliance, and that's not going to break their budget.
Now, the other question I wanted to ask was, when we talk about politically exposed persons, what does that mean, and why do we not want to be transacting business with such people?
So in the United States, what we mean by it, at least in the financial institution world and under the Bank Secrecy Act and anti-money laundering regulations, is a senior foreign political figure, someone high up in the government who may be influential, who may be corrupt, maybe trying to move the proceeds of corruption out of their country. They're generally higher risk for money laundering, higher risk for corruption. Globally, take out the foreign, and it's just a senior political figure.
If someone is a senior political figure and they're all of a sudden, buying a lot of high-end art, that there is at least a question to be asked whether the funds have come from some corruption in their countries.
There are many cases out there about corruption involving, dictators. You can read about it. There's the sons and daughters and the close relatives of the dictators who may be pillaging the natural resources of the country, taking the money for their own corrupt objectives, and not giving it back to the country where they are. Though they have a government job where they're paid $200,000, yet they have accounts in the United States with billions of dollars in it. Well, where'd that money come from?
Yeah, I agree. I just is, putting my hat on thinking, well, if I'm a dealer, I'm thinking, well, wait, but it's rich people who buy my work. These are the people I've always sold to. So what, are you trying to kill my business?
Yeah, well, I think you will hear that. That is a concern. Are there other red flags that are specific to, the transaction and the object that people should be aware of?
I'll leave the object to Laura, but with regard to the transaction, remote deals, not face-to-face, they're higher risk. That's why I mentioned earlier when assessing risk, what are the channels? Is it over the internet? Is it on the telephone? Non-face-to-face. Face-to-face, you get to face off with the person, ask the questions, you know who you're talking to, you know who you're dealing with. Cash transactions can be suspicious. Even an offer to pay a substantial cash payment for a work of art might raise red flags. Illogical offshore accounts, Laura covered that earlier today. Those can be red flags. Structured payments below government reporting thresholds. Shipping art unexpectedly to a jurisdiction unassociated with the client. Laura mentioned that earlier. That should raise a red flag and might cause pause. If the purchases exceed a client's known resources. The example would be the dictator that I just used, whose government job is on the internet. It says that he makes $200,000 a year, yet they're buying art for, in the tens of millions of dollars. Where are they getting that money from? That ought to raise a red flag and ought to cause someone pause before entering into a transaction. And while someone may contend, well, that's killing my business, it's not killing your business. It's helping you do business that's legitimate, because you don't want to enter into a transaction where you become the target of a government investigation.
Right. Multiple
sales of recently purchased art. That could be layering. That could be trying to transfer the art to transfer value. You need to monitor that. And obvious, over and under pricing, that could be a red flag too.
Yeah, you're right. The flipping of art is definitely a red flag. It's also something that the trade does not like because it messes up the value of the artist.
Sure.
From objects, the very first question is the whole and the provenance. For any kind of investigation into art, including money laundering, that's the number one question. Also, there are certain types of objects that could be more susceptible to money laundering. For example, antiquities. We know for a fact that antiquities have been looted en masse in Syria, Yemen, and other places where the Islamic State and other terrorist organizations have been active. That's not an opinion. That's a proven fact based on satellite photos and evidence seized during the raid on Abu Sayyaf's compound. Abu Sayyaf was the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Antiquities for the Islamic State, or Daesh. And when U.S. forces raided his compound, they found not only antiquities, freshly looted antiquities, they also found Western catalogs, price lists, bank numbers. Now, you can also look at, and I have not looked at this particular piece of information, but it's been widely reported, that imports into the U.S. of antiquities from the Middle East, just writ large, and by that we define that as anything that's 100 years old or older, increased during the same period, starting soon after ISIL took over most of Syria to the time they lost most of it. That's not saying those particular objects are being sold here, but we do know that the types of objects that terrorist organizations in the Middle East are selling to raise hard currency are very popular among certain collectors in the United States and Western Europe. So,
I think if I were engaged in the business of buying and selling antiquities, I would have 2 lawyers and 2 consultants from Deloitte at my side at all
go
times.
out of business.
well,
It seems so fraught with danger. Maybe we can talk more concretely about a couple of recent examples where people have been caught up in money laundering schemes. And I'm thinking initially of Matthew Green.
Yeah, the Matthew Green example is an excellent one. The U.S. Department of Justice charged a UK-based art dealer, Matthew Green, with a scheme to launder money through high-end artwork. This was actually a sting operation that was targeted at UK brokerage and penny stock market manipulation, not the art market. So you had undercover agents posing as criminals who needed to launder money, and they were proposing a stock fraud scheme with the UK brokerage. Well, after the stock fraud, they would need to launder the money because those would be illicit proceeds. Well, the brokerage house introduced them, allegedly, these are all allegations to date, they allegedly introduced them to Matthew Green. And Mr. Green, who was a well-known art dealer, I believe in the Mayfair section of London, agreed to sell art to the agents to launder the money. And the agents allegedly told him the purpose. The purpose was, we're selling the stock. These are going to be the proceeds of stock fraud and penny stock market manipulation. And allegedly he agreed to do this. So he's under indictment right now.
And it was a Picasso, which was a nice round sum. I think it was about $10 million.
That reminds me, when we're talking about objects that are more vulnerable to money laundering, in the cases I've seen, in the U.S. at least, the mid-level works by well-known artists. For example, a Picasso, not the best Picasso, but a good Picasso, tend to be involved because the really high, the splashy objects get a lot of attention.
Right.
Now, there could be a case that comes, to the fore soon that throws that, theory out the door. But
what I remember now about the Matthew Green case is that the idea would be that he would sell them the Picasso and then he would arrange to buy it back in a couple of years, and the launderers were proposing a commission to him of 5%. And he said, no, it needs to be higher because if it's 5%, it'll look like I'm laundering money. Like, why would I be doing this transaction for 5%? It has to be, realistically, it has to be higher. And, when I said earlier that money laundering requires intent, if all of these things are true, this is sort of the classic case of showing intent, that he knew exactly what he was doing, and what he was doing was trying to hide the proceeds of an illegal act.
And most money launderers would be willing to lose more than a 5% commission, by the way.
So let's talk about scenarios now where we're not talking about people who are intentionally engaged in money laundering, but how is it that both in Europe and here, governments are trying to impose some of these, what we've been talking about as best practices on dealers of art and antiquities?
Well, in Europe, the fifth directive on money laundering requires art sellers, dealers, auction houses, basically art vendors of any type, to be compliant with a new higher level of anti-money laundering practices and procedures. And that's 2020. It's just around the corner.
And that's anyone selling in Europe. So even if you're a U.S. gallery, but you have a gallery arm in London, or a gallery arm in Paris
now. So that is my
now.
understanding, but I am not the lawyer in the room, so I'm going to let lawyers.
Yes, and we're not
answer
European
that.
lawyers, but I think.
But yes.
But there's also
is the common sense.
There is
yes.
a threshold as well, right?
$10,000
pounds
yeah.
or euros.
Euros.
10,000
10,000
euros.
euros.
Sorry, yes.
Yeah, and if you go to Maastricht or Basel,
It's everything.
Everything is above 10,000 euros. So that's in Europe. In the US, there's HR 5886, which is the Illicit Art and Antiquities Trafficking Prevention Act. It was introduced last year. It seems to have stalled, but there is certainly ongoing interest and conversation, both on the executive branch and the Hill side of Washington about this issue.
And that proposed legislation, which again has not passed,
Right.
it would extend bank secrecy regulations to the art market. And in the state it is now, just generally to the art market, right?
Right. I don't think the mechanics of how that would happen are clear. For example, financial institutions, and Michael can talk more about this, are required to file suspicious activity reports. I can see from a gallery's perspective that this is brand new territory for them. They would, if I were able to recommend something, I would say that they should have one person dedicated to that, in part so that it doesn't damage the relationships between the dealers and the buyers. But, also, galleries, the resistance I hear is, wait a minute, we have to spy on our clients? No, that's not exactly it. And Michael, maybe you could talk a little bit about what a suspicious activity report is.
Yeah, and also just what the Bank Secrecy Act does generally, so people can have a sense of what now dealers and art market players would have to do if this type of legislation was passed.
Well, we'd have to see what the legislation would entail, but for financial institutions and covered entities, money services businesses are covered. The jewelry industry is covered in part, and you have other industries as well. One, you have to have an AML compliance program. Okay, that would be the first thing.
Like a written policy.
A written policy and procedures and controls in place. Okay, it's not just the written documents, it's what's the control.
Can you define control for people in the art market?
Sure. A control would be, for instance, a KYC form, a Know Your Client form that's actually filled out. Another control would be monitoring. Another control would be sanctions screening, which I would love to come back to because every art dealer is subject to OFAC right now, and if they're not screening, that's a huge risk. So we can come back to that. So an AML compliance program, they do have to have a Bank Secrecy Act officer, someone who's qualified to oversee the program. There needs to be training. And there needs to be
training of all staff.
Training of all staff on what is anti-money laundering and what are our procedures. How do we comply with it? Fourth, there has to be independent testing. A third party that didn't put the program in place coming in to assess the program, whether it's adequate under the law and whether it's working.
Like an audit.
It's an internal audit. There's now a fifth pillar, which is KYC, which is the beneficial owner. And testing of the program might or might not be required. I suspect it would be because it's something that proves that the program is working as intended.
Yeah. And do you think financial thresholds for application to the art market are likely or would be appropriate? I mean, I can see that if you're a dealer and you stand to make $50 million off a transaction, I personally perceive that person as having an obligation to do this type of due diligence, and even if it costs something, it's going to be small relative to the overall upside. Whereas if you're selling, one work a month for $20,000 and, you have one staff member, that's going to be a lot more onerous and challenging.
My personal view is that there ought to be thresholds. And they should be, fairly substantial, in the tens of thousands of dollars.
Right, because I don't think anybody wants to make barriers to entry higher it's already hard for small businesses in the art market to get up and running.
Right. And to get people, I think there's two challenges. One is getting more people who are not art market sophisticates interested in the art world so they will buy a $5,000 work of art or $10,000 work of art if they have some excess capital. And, the other is the survival of these small galleries and dealers who are really one or two staff member businesses who are trying to make a go at selling relatively lower priced works of art to a broader array of people and engaging a larger number of people in an art market that was, has traditionally been very elitist. So,
we're seeing an increase, maybe not in the higher end market other than antiquities, of internet deals. So that's another dimension, another channel, another,
Does that raise
offering.
the risk factors?
Yes, without a doubt.
Absolutely.
it raises, and, apart from these financial crimes issues, Steve and I have talked on other podcasts about all kinds of risks that come from internet sales and not seeing an object, not seeing its provenance in person. Right. So, that's in general, people should be wary. So the European regulations are definitely coming into effect.
Yes.
We don't know about the U.S. regulations, but the general question that remains to be seen is to what extent can players in the art world act like banks? And both, are they able to? Is the law going to really treat them that way? And, what's in between?
Again, I keep going back to this term, risk-based compliance program. If you assess your risks and then put controls in place to mitigate those risks, you have a justifiable program. If something does go wrong, you can say to the government, I had a program. It's a one-off.
Right.
That's a mitigant against, facing large fines, facing prosecution. So again, risk-based programs should be documented. There should be training. It should be assessed on occasion to make sure it's working as intended and that the employees are doing what they're supposed to do. That's really what's required.
So with all of these potential risks, can technology help? Is there anything on the horizon that you think might be useful in trying to prevent some of these problems? We can't not talk about blockchain.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say blockchain is the hot word, right? So, look, distributed ledger technology is not new, right? Blockchain, this is a variation on that, and it's a double-edged sword from my perspective.
I was just going to say that, yeah.
Right. On one hand, it can verify that only these four parties are allowed to, or these are the right parties making the transaction. On the other hand, it can be used by money launderers to identify that, yes, I'm the right person. It doesn't say whether I'm, have clean money or not.
Right, and obviously, potentially the use of cryptocurrency is also a concern and something that's certainly being addressed in Europe as, part of the money laundering initiatives.
Right, and certainly, there are systems that look at risk across entire enterprises, specifically looking at money laundering. There are some systems in development that are specific to the art market. But these are new to the art market, and so will need to be curated accordingly.
Everything else that has been developed was for the financial institutions specifically, and new products for the larger art industry companies, they'll be forthcoming.
Michael, you mentioned that the big galleries are sitting on so much data, right? If the imperfect information of the market is what gives some people advantages, right? It's always been that way. So the large galleries could, and I don't know to what extent they already have, well, I know a couple, but not all of them, can take all this data, start running it through analytics, and there's machine learning that can make actually predictive analytics about deals that they can say, hey, this is going to be risky. Do you want to do this? Even before you do it.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about that in a different setting with Jason Bailey, who was our last guest, talking about, blockchain and technology in the arts, that there really hasn't yet been a huge push to build this predictive analytic technology, but there certainly should be, and about all kinds of things about art, how much it'll sell for, how much you could resell it for.
Yeah, and there are a lot of different entities out there
working on
that. We've been trying to we have put together a way of looking at art transactions and holdings by bringing together the object, counterparty, and transactional operations, and bringing all those disparate pieces of data together to get a better understanding of potential risk.
If someone hires Deloitte to do a risk analysis, you've built those tools internally to do it.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Michael and Laura, for being with us. This was fascinating, and we look forward to...
Thank you for having us.
Thanks. This has been great.
Yeah.
And that's it for today's podcast. Please subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts, and send us feedback at podcast@schlaw.com. And if you like what you hear, give us a 5-star rating. We are also featuring the original music of Chris Thompson. And finally, we want to thank our fabulous producer, Jackie Santos, for making us sound so good.
Until next time, I'm Katie Wilson-Milne.
And I'm Steve Schindler, bringing you the Art Law Podcast, a podcast exploring the places where art intersects with and interferes with the law.
And vice versa. The information provided in this podcast is not intended to be a source of legal advice. You should not consider the information provided to be an invitation for an attorney-client relationship, should not rely on the information as legal advice for any purpose, and should always seek the legal advice of competent counsel in the relevant jurisdiction.